We're continuing the literature review, and in this particular section, he really zeroes in on the acquisition of French vowels by L2 learners. You know, that whole tricky process of hearing a new sound, making sense of it, and then actually trying to produce it yourself. It's a real journey.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get into the acoustics of French vowels. Then, we'll look at three key studies covering learner experience, the pull of your first language, and even exposure to different dialects. After that, we'll focus on the number one phonetic challenge before wrapping it all up with the key takeaways. Let's get into it. So first up, French vowel acoustics. You might be wondering, how do you even measure if someone's getting vowels right? Well, the author bases his review on studies that use what's called acoustic analysis. What we're really talking about is looking at the actual sound waves, the hard data to understand three key things: perception, production, and categorization. Basically, what learners hear, what they say, and how their brain sorts it all out. Now, the author's whole analysis really rests on these three cornerstone studies. They give us a fantastic all-around view of the challenges and the breakthroughs people have when learning French vowels. So let's dive into that first one. All right, first up, we've got a study from Lang and Davidson from 2019. They were looking at something called phonetic drift, specifically in English speakers learning French, which, in simple terms, just means how does their pronunciation change or drift over time as they get more experience. And they focused on these 6 specific French vowels. Now, these are some of the heavy hitters, the ones that are notoriously difficult for English speakers. You've got these front-rounded vowels that just don't exist in English. This research really digs into why they're such a headache. So what did they find? Well, a few big things. First, learners had a really tough time telling the difference between vowels made in the front of the mouth and those made in the back. And here's an interesting twist. When a French vowel sounded sort of like an English one, it actually made things worse. It just led to confusion. But there's a silver lining. The more time they spent immersed in French, the better they got. And this quote from the study really drives the point home. It says that with prolonged experience in a French-speaking environment, learners started to categorize vowels in a way that was much more native-like. So immersion isn't just some fluffy idea, right? It has a real, measurable impact. That direct experience is absolutely crucial. Okay, that leads us perfectly into our second study, this one from Darcy and the team. They build on this idea of experience, but they add a new layer. It's not just about what you're learning, it's about what you already know. So the big question is, how does your first language, your L1, shape how you hear and learn a second one? This time, the focus was on these 4 vowels. The researchers were really interested in the whole mental process, you know? How does your brain take this new acoustic information it's hearing and try to, fit it onto its brand new, still under construction map of French sounds? Especially for these really tricky ones. And what they found was pretty revealing. It turns out L2 learners were categorizing these vowels differently than native speakers. And not just that, the actual acoustic properties of the vowels they produced were different too. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just true for beginners. It affected both intermediate and advanced learners. That L1 influence is incredibly persistent. So, the main takeaway here is pretty clear. The study says these results show just how powerful that L1 influence is. A learner's brain is basically trying to make sense of new French sounds using its Old English framework. And it's fascinating. It's both the similarities and the differences between the two languages that cause these predictable hurdles. All right, on to our third and final study. This one, by Baker and Smith, adds another fascinating wrinkle to the story. We've got experience, we've got L1 influence, but what if the French you're learning isn't all the same? They looked at how being exposed to a specific dialect of French changes everything. And check this out. They found that English speakers learning Quebec French were actually better at telling certain vowels apart than people learning standard French. That's huge. It means the specific acoustic flavor of the dialect you learn can literally help or hurt your ability to hear the differences. Specifically, they were looking at these 3 vowels. Now, these guys are acoustically super close to each other. They're all high vowels. For an English-speaking brain, trying to distinguish between them is a real challenge. So what's the bottom line here? This quote says it all.
L2 dialect exposure affects how learners perceive and produce these three French vowels. It's not just learning French. The kind of French you're hearing creates a unique soundscape, and that soundscape directly molds your pronunciation and your listening skills. The input you get is everything.
Okay, so we've looked at 3 different studies from 3 different angles. And the author points out that they all seem to circle back to one core problem. There is one specific phonetic challenge that just keeps popping up again and again for English speakers.
And here's the main event. It's the showdown between the vowel U and the vowel U. U is a front vowel, and here's the key. It's not in the English inventory. It's a totally new sound. Meanwhile, U is a back vowel, and it has a pretty close relative in English. And that right there, that's the source of all the trouble.
So let's just state the obvious question. Why? Why is this one distinction so incredibly hard for native English speakers to get right? Well, thankfully, the research we've just walked through gives us some really clear answers. It pretty much boils down to this. First off, that U vowel sound is just not there in the English phonetic toolbox. So when an English-speaking brain hears it, what does it do? It panics and grabs the next best thing, which is the acoustically similar oo sound. The end result is that learners just mush them together and can't quite produce that new sound in a way that sounds native. Okay, let's pull back and look at the big picture. After reviewing all this research, the author synthesizes everything down into a really clear set of key factors that influence how someone learns French vowels. And it turns out, it's not just one magic bullet. Success really comes down to a mix of 4 key ingredients. You've got the sound system of your first language, how acoustically similar the vowels are to each other, how much real-world experience you have, and finally, the specific dialect of French you're learning. All 4 play a huge role.